I never wanted to know what my grandfather did during the war. That's the truth. Most families have stories, proud ones, tragic ones, the kind you repeat at dinner tables or whisper to children before bed. We had silence. My grandfather, Heinrich Volker, died in 1987. He left behind a small apartment in Stuttgart, a collection of books about trains, and an envelope addressed to me. I was 11 years old when he died. The envelope stayed sealed for 23 years. I don't know why I finally opened it. Maybe because I'd become a historian. Maybe because I thought I could handle it. Maybe because I was tired of pretending the past didn't matter. My grandmother had been dead for 5 years by then. She'd never talked about the war either. But sometimes late at night, I'd hear her crying in the kitchen. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd just shake her head and say, "Some things are too heavy to share." I didn't understand then. I do now. Inside the envelope there were 3 things: a black and white photograph of a warehouse, a handwritten list of numbers, and a note in his handwriting that said, "This is what I carried. Forgive me if you can." The photograph showed a massive building, industrial, cold, with steel beams cutting across the frame like ribs. In the foreground, men in Wehrmacht uniforms stood beside wooden crates. They looked tired, young. Some of them couldn't have been older than 18. One of them was my grandfather. He looked young, thin. His eyes were shadowed, but his posture was rigid, like he was trying to disappear into the uniform itself. His hands were clasped behind his back. His jaw was tight. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at something off to the side, something the photographer didn't capture. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, Lager 7, März 1945, Warehouse 7, March 1945. I didn't recognize the location, but I recognized the look on his face. It was the same look he had every time someone asked him about the war. The look of a man who knew something he could never say. The look of a man haunted. The list of numbers made no sense at first. Rows and rows of figures, some crossed out, some circled. They ranged from 3 digits to 7. Some had letters beside them. K, M, P, W. No explanation, no context, just numbers. I photographed everything and began my research. I spent 2 weeks searching. Archives in Berlin, Munich, Stuttgart. I filed requests with the Federal Archives. I contacted historians specializing in Wehrmacht logistics. I searched through databases of military installations. I found references to supply depots, munitions storage, even buried weapon caches, but nothing about Warehouse 7. It wasn't in any official record, not in the Wehrmacht logistics reports, not in the Allied capture documents, not in the post-war commissions. It was as if the place had never existed. But the photograph was real. The numbers on the list were real, and my grandfather's handwriting, shaky, desperate, was real. I kept digging. I contacted historians, archivists, even former military personnel. No one had heard of Warehouse 7. Some suggested it might have been a code name. Others thought it was a fabrication. One archivist told me there were hundreds of unofficial storage facilities throughout Germany and Austria in the final months of the war. Most of them were never documented, he said. They were built in secret, emptied in secret, and destroyed in secret. Why? He looked at me carefully. Because what was inside them wasn't meant to be found, but I knew better. My grandfather wasn't the kind of man to fabricate anything. He was meticulous, careful. He documented everything. His entire life was ordered, controlled, precise, as if he was trying to impose structure on chaos, as if he was trying to contain something that threatened to spill out. And then, in a private collection in Vienna, I found something, a declassified British intelligence memo from June 1945. It was marked "Restricted, Eyes Only." The memo was short. It mentioned a suspected storage facility near the Austrian border, discovered by American forces in late April 1945. The facility had been emptied before they arrived, but one soldier reported finding scorch marks on the floor and traces of molten metal. The memo ended with a single line: "Contents unknown. likely destroyed or relocated. Investigation suspended. I stared at that line for a long time. Investigation suspended. Not closed, suspended, because someone didn't want it found. Because someone had decided that whatever was in that warehouse was better left buried. Someone with authority. Someone with power. Someone who wanted the truth to disappear. I went back to the photograph. I studied every detail, the crates, the beams, the shadows. I used a magnifying glass. I scanned it at high resolution, and then I saw it. In the far corner of the image, barely visible behind a stack of crates, was a stenciled number on the wall. A Warehouse 7, Section A. I knew then that my grandfather hadn't been guarding weapons. He'd been guarding something else, something they didn't want the world to see, something they were willing to erase from history. I booked a flight to Austria the next day. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't tell my colleagues. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew I had to see it for myself because some secrets don't stay buried. They wait. They wait for someone willing to dig. They wait for someone willing to carry the weight. The village was called Kleinhof. It sat in a valley near the Austrian-German border, surrounded by forests that looked like they hadn't changed in 100 years. Population, 312, most of them elderly. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers are noticed immediately. I arrived on a Tuesday morning. The sky was grey, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. There was a stillness to the place, not peaceful, just still. Like the village itself was holding its breath. I rented a room above a bakery. The owner, Frau Kessler, was in her 70s. She had sharp eyes and a voice like gravel. When I told her I was researching the war, she went quiet. She was kneading dough when I said it. Her hands stopped moving. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "We don't talk about that here." I asked why. She turned away, wiping her hands on her apron. Because talking doesn't change what happened. But remembering might. She looked at me then, really looked at me. Remembering just makes it hurt longer. She went back to her dough, pressing it flat with more force than necessary. "People come here sometimes," she said, "looking for answers, looking for closure. And do they find it? No." She shaped the dough into a loaf. "They just leave more disturbed than when they arrived." I spent the first day walking through the village. There was a church, a post office, a small market. The church was old, medieval stone, with a small cemetery beside it. I walked through the graves. Most of them were recent. But in the far corner, I found a section with older headstones. More deaths than usual for those years. Young men, mostly. No details about how they died, just names and dates. And at the edge of town, near the forest, there was an old railway line, rusted, overgrown. It hadn't been used in decades. The tracks were barely visible beneath the grass and wildflowers. I followed it for 2 kilometers. The rails disappeared into the trees, and then I saw it, a concrete foundation, cracked, covered in moss, but unmistakable. It was the remains of a building, massive, industrial. The same proportions as the warehouse in the photograph. My heart began to race. I knelt down and brushed away the dirt. Beneath the moss, I found a metal plate bolted to the concrete. The paint was faded, but I could still make out the numbers. My hands were shaking. This was it. This was Warehouse 7, the place my grandfather had guarded, the place that had been erased from history. But the earth remembers. Concrete doesn't lie. I spent the next 3 hours searching the site. The structure was mostly gone, torn down, burned or reclaimed by the forest. But the foundation remained, and scattered around it I found fragments, pieces of machinery, rusted metal plates, broken bricks, stamped with German manufacturers' marks. And in one corner, half buried in the soil, I found something, a steel rail, not from the train line. This was different, thicker, industrial. It had rollers attached, a conveyor system. I pulled it free and examined it. There were marks on the metal, scratches, gouges, signs of heavy use, and something else, a faint residue, gold-colored. It caught the light when I tilted it. I scraped a sample into a plastic bag. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew it mattered. The forest around me was silent. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. I felt like I was standing on sacred ground or cursed ground. I wasn't sure which, maybe both. I took photographs of everything: the foundation, the conveyor rail, the metal plates, the surrounding forest. I marked the location on my GPS, and then I stood there for a long time just looking, trying to imagine what this place had been, trying to imagine my grandfather standing here, 17 years old, guarding something he didn't understand. Or maybe he did understand. Maybe that's why he never came back. That night I went back to the bakery. Frau Kessler was closing up. The smell of fresh bread still hung in the air. I asked her if anyone in the village remembered the warehouse. She didn't answer right away. She wiped down the counter slowly, methodically. Then she said, "There's one man, Otto Brenner. He lives alone at the end of Bergstrasse." She paused. "But he won't talk to you." I asked why. She looked at me for a long moment. "Because he was there." She turned off the lights. "And because talking about it almost killed him once already." She walked to the door and held it open for me. "He tried to tell someone. Back in the 60s, a journalist from Munich. What happened? He had a breakdown, spent 3 months in a hospital. She locked the door behind us. After that, he never spoke about it again." "Why are you telling me this?" Frau Kessler looked up at the dark sky. "Because you have the look." "What look?" "The look of someone who won't stop until they know." She turned to me. "Just be careful. Some truths are dangerous." Otto Brenner's house was small, tucked behind a row of pine trees. The windows were dark. The yard was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. A rusted bicycle leaned against the porch. There were no lights on, no smoke from the chimney. For a moment, I thought no one lived there anymore. I knocked 3 times before he answered. He was old, maybe 90, with a face like carved stone, deep lines around his eyes, hands that trembled slightly. He looked at me without speaking. I introduced myself. I told him I was researching Warehouse 7. He started to close the door. I said, "My grandfather was Heinrich Volker. He was there in March 1945. Otto stopped. His hand trembled on the doorframe. "Volker," he said quietly. "Yes." He stared at me for a long time. His eyes were pale blue, watery with age. I could see him deciding to speak or to close the door, to continue the silence or to break it. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of the house was sparse, a single chair by the window, a table with a half-finished cup of coffee. No photographs, no decoration, just silence. The kind of silence that feels like a presence, like something living. Otto sat down heavily. He didn't offer me a seat. "Your grandfather," he said. "He was logistics corps." "Yes." Otto nodded slowly. "I was a driver, 17 years old. They sent me there in February." He looked out the window. "They told us it was a supply depot, fuel, ammunition, rations." He paused. "We believed them, or maybe we just didn't ask questions. But it wasn't. No." He was quiet for a long moment. I waited. Outside, a crow called. Then he said, "It was gold." The word hung in the air between us. Gold. I sat down across from him without asking. "Tell me," I said. Otto closed his eyes. "They brought it in at night. Train cars, trucks. Crates so heavy it took 4 men to lift one. Where did it come from?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Banks," he said. "Museums, private homes, from all over Europe." He opened his eyes. They melted it down. Right there in the warehouse, turned it into bars, stamped them with Wehrmacht seals. Why? To hide where it came from. My stomach turned. I thought about the residue I'd found, the gold-colored traces on the conveyor rail. "How much?" I asked. Otto looked at me. "Hundreds of tons." I couldn't breathe. Hundreds of tons. Not supplies, not weapons. Lives, entire communities, entire families, reduced to metal bars. And what happened to it? Otto's face darkened. "That's the part no one talks about." He stood up slowly, his joints creaking. He walked to a shelf and pulled down a small wooden box. Inside was a single document, a transport manifest, dated March 29th, 1945. It listed 17 train cars, destination unknown. Otto handed it to me with shaking hands. They evacuated the warehouse in late March, loaded everything onto trains, sent them south. Where? No one knows. The trains never arrived at any official depot. He sat back down. Your grandfather was one of the guards on the last convoy. I felt cold. What happened to him? Otto looked away. He came back alone. What do you mean alone? I mean everyone else on that convoy died. He paused, or disappeared. And my grandfather? He walked back into the village 3 days later, covered in mud, wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat. Otto's voice cracked. I saw him once after that, just before he left for good. What did he say? Nothing, but I saw his eyes. Otto looked at me. He looked like a man who'd seen hell. Otto stood up and walked to the window. He stared out at the forest for a long time. I dream about it sometimes, he said. The warehouse, the gold, the men loading the trains. He turned to me. And I dream about the silence, the way we all just stopped talking about it. Why did you stop? Because no one wanted to remember. The war was over. People wanted to move on. He paused. And because some of us were ashamed. Of what? Of what we'd done. Of what we'd been part of. He looked down at his hands. We told ourselves we were just following orders, that we didn't have a choice. Did you? Otto didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at his hands, as if they belonged to someone else. I stayed in Kleinhof for another week. Otto didn't want to talk anymore, but he gave me the manifest, and he gave me one more thing, a name. If you want the truth, he said, find Erich Mundt. He was the quartermaster. He knew everything. Where is he? Dead, 30 years ago. My heart sank. But, Otto added, his daughter still lives in Innsbruck. Her name is Anna. I thanked him. Before I left, I asked one last question. Why didn't anyone report this after the war? Otto looked at me with hollow eyes. Because the people who knew were either dead or they were complicit. He paused. Your grandfather knew. I knew. We all knew. And you stayed silent. Yes. Why? Otto's voice was barely a whisper, because silence was easier than guilt. He looked down at his hands, and because speaking up would have meant admitting we were part of it. He walked me to the door. Before I left, he touched my arm. Your grandfather, he said, he was a good man. He was young. We all were. That doesn't excuse it. No, it doesn't. Otto looked at me with tired eyes. But maybe it explains it. I drove to Innsbruck the next morning. The city was beautiful, alpine, crisp, surrounded by mountains that felt both protective and imprisoning. Anna Mundt lived in a small apartment near the university. She was in her 70s, a retired schoolteacher. When I explained who I was and why I'd come, she invited me in without hesitation. Her apartment was warm, filled with books and photographs, plants in every window, the smell of tea and old paper. She offered me tea. We sat by the window, looking out at the mountains. My father never talked about the war, she said, not until the very end. What did he say? Anna looked down at her hands. He said he'd been part of something terrible, something he couldn't undo. She paused. He said he'd kept records. Not because he was proud, but because he was afraid people would forget. Forget what? What was taken, and from whom? She stood up and walked to a desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and pulled out a leather journal. Worn, stained, heavy with use. He left this. I've never shown it to anyone. She handed it to me. The journal was old, the pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was careful, precise. I opened it to the first entry. February 12th, 1945. The warehouse is operational. First shipment arrived today. 14 crates, contents, confiscated assets, origin classified. I turned the pages carefully. February 28th. The furnaces run day and night. The men don't ask questions. They know better. March 5th. Another shipment. This one from Prague. Religious artifacts, candlesticks, Torah covers. I watched them melt it all down. No one said a word. March 15th. Orders received. Prepare for evacuation. All records to be destroyed. March 22. They're burning documents now. Anything that could trace the gold back to its source, but I've kept copies, hidden, just in case. March 29th. Final convoy departs tonight. 17 cars. Destination, Alpine Pass, Route 7. And then the last entry, April 2nd. The convoy never reached its destination. Reports say it was ambushed, but I don't believe that. I think they hid it. And I think they killed anyone who knew where. I looked up at Anna. Did your father know where the convoy went? She nodded slowly. He suspected. But he never went looking. Why not? Because he was afraid of what he'd find, she paused. Or who? I asked her what she meant. Anna leaned forward. My father believed the convoy was intercepted, not by allies, not by partisans. Then by who? By our own men, SS officers, high-ranking, men who wanted to disappear after the war. And the gold? They took it, hid it, used it to build new lives. I felt a chill run through me. Do you know their names? No. But my father wrote something in the back of the journal, something he never explained. She flipped to the last page. There, in faint pencil, was a single word, Adlerhorst, Eagle's Nest. Beneath it, 3 sets of initials, KSFWHL. Who are they? I asked. Anna shook her head. I don't know. My father never told me. She looked out the window. But I know he was afraid of them. She turned back to me. He used to wake up at night, calling out those initials in his sleep. Did you ever try to find out who they were? Once, when I was younger. What happened? Anna's face darkened. I received a phone call, a man's voice. He told me to stop asking questions. Did you recognize the voice? No, but the message was clear. She paused. Some secrets are protected even now. Adlerhorst wasn't a place. It was a code name. I spent 3 days in Innsbruck, searching through archives, military records, old maps. Most of the wartime documents had been destroyed, or conveniently lost, but I found fragments, references to Operation Adlerhorst in SS communications from early 1945, plans to secure high-value assets in Alpine regions, mentions of safe routes into Italy and Switzerland. And then I found it, a reference in a Swiss intelligence report from 1946, Adlerhorst, suspected SS safehouse, location unconfirmed, believed to be situated near Alpine Pass 7, Austrian-Italian border. Alpine Pass 7, the same route mentioned in Erich Mundt's journal. I hired a guide, a local mountaineer named Stefan. He was in his 50s, weathered, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent his life in the mountains. When I told him I was looking for an old wartime route, he didn't ask questions. He just nodded. There are dozens of them, he said. Most are gone now, buried under rock slides or reclaimed by the forest. But some still exist. Some. We set out the next morning before dawn. The trail was steep, narrow, winding through dense forest and across rocky ridges. Stefan moved with ease. I struggled to keep up. The air grew thinner as we climbed. The forest gave way to bare rock and snow. It took us 6 hours to reach the summit, and there, hidden in a ravine, we found it. The remains of a railway spur, rusted, overgrown, but unmistakable. Stefan crouched down, examining the rails. This was built during the war, he said, probably for supply transport. He looked up at me. But this is strange. What? The rails don't go anywhere, they just stop. I followed the tracks deeper into the ravine, and then I saw it, a tunnel, carved into the mountainside. The entrance was partially collapsed, but there was still a gap, just wide enough to squeeze through. Stefan hesitated. Are you sure about this? I nodded. We crawled inside. The tunnel was dark, cold, dripping with condensation. Our flashlights cut through the blackness. The walls were rough-hewn stone, reinforced with timber beams. Some of them were rotting. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. We walked for 10 minutes in silence. Our footsteps echoed, and then the tunnel opened up into a cavern, massive, carved out of the mountain itself, and in the center, half buried under rubble and debris, were the remains of train cars, 17 of them, rusted, hollow, empty. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The cars had been stripped clean. But on the floor of one, I found something, a single bar of metal, gold, stamped with a Wehrmacht seal. And beneath it, scratched into the stone floor, were initials, H.V. Heinrich Volker. My grandfather had been here. He'd stood exactly where I was standing. He'd seen what I was seeing, and then he'd left, alone. I picked up the gold bar. It was heavy, cold. It felt like holding a piece of someone's life. Stefan came up beside me. "What is this place?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. I looked around the cavern, at the empty train cars, at the shadows on the walls, at the silence. "A grave," I said finally. "A grave for what?" "For the truth." We searched the cavern for another hour. We found more traces, bullet holes in the walls, bloodstains on the floor, faded but still visible, and in the far corner, partially hidden under debris, we found bones, human bones. Stefan and I stood there in silence. "What happened here?" he whispered. I thought about my grandfather's letter, about the convoy that never arrived, about the men who died. "An execution," I said. "Who?" "The guards, the witnesses, anyone who knew." I looked at the bones. They were killed by their own men. I took the gold bar back to Innsbruck. I had it analyzed by a metallurgist at the university. The results confirmed it. The gold was European in origin, smelted in the 1940s, and the stamp matched Wehrmacht standards. But there was something else. Trace elements in the metal, copper, silver, indicated it had been melted down from mixed sources, jewelry, coins, religious artifacts, stolen. I sat in my hotel room that night, staring at the bar. It wasn't just gold, it was lives, entire families, entire communities, reduced to a piece of metal, someone's wedding ring, someone's grandmother's necklace, someone's Sabbath candlesticks, all melted down, all made anonymous, and my grandfather had guarded it. I wanted to hate him, but I couldn't, because I knew he'd been 17 years old, a boy in a uniform, told to follow orders, told not to ask questions. But knowing doesn't erase complicity, and that's the weight he carried for the rest of his life. That's the weight he tried to pass to me. The next morning I went back to Anna Munt. I showed her the gold bar. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she said, "My father used to say that guilt has a weight. You can't see it, but you can feel it. Every day." She paused. "He felt it until the day he died." I asked her if she knew what happened to the gold. "Some of it was recovered," she said, "after the war, but most of it disappeared." "Where?" "Switzerland, Argentina, Spain, anywhere men with money and no conscience could hide." She looked at me. "The people who took it built empires. They lived in mansions. They sent their children to universities." Her voice was hard, and no one ever asked where the money came from. I asked her if she had names. She shook her head. "My father never wrote them down. He was too afraid." "But you suspect?" "Yes." She went to her desk and pulled out a folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, obituaries mostly. Rich men, businessmen, industrialists. All of them had moved to South America or Switzerland in the late 1940s. All of them had died wealthy, respected, honored, and none of them had ever been investigated. "These men," Anna said, "they didn't just steal gold, they stole futures." She closed the folder. "They stole names. They stole memory." She looked at me with fierce eyes, and no one ever made them pay. I asked if I could borrow her father's journal. She hesitated. Then she handed it to me. "Bring it back," she said. "It's all I have left of him." I promised I would. As I was leaving, she called out to me. "There's something else," she said. She walked to her bedroom and returned with a small envelope. "My father left this for me. He said if anyone ever came looking for the truth, I should give it to them." She handed me the envelope. Inside was a photograph. It showed 3 men in SS uniforms. On the back, written in Erich Mundt's handwriting, K. Steiner, F. Weber, H. Linz Adlerhorst. April 1945. I looked at their faces. They were smiling. I returned to Germany a week later. I couldn't stop thinking about the train cars, about the gold, about my grandfather standing in that cavern, scratching his initials into stone. What had he been thinking? Was it a confession, a claim, a warning? I went back to his apartment, the one I'd inherited after his death. I hadn't been there in years. It was small, dusty, untouched, everything exactly as he'd left it. I searched through his things again, more carefully this time. Books, papers, old photographs, and then in the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden beneath a stack of train timetables, I found another envelope. This one wasn't addressed to anyone. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated April 1945. The paper was thin, yellowed, brittle. The ink had faded in places, but the words were clear. To whoever finds this, I was part of something I cannot undo. I was told it was duty. I was told it was survival, but I know what it was. Theft, murder, betrayal. I stood guard while they melted down the lives of thousands. I watched as they loaded it onto trains. I escorted it into the mountains, and when the convoy was ambushed, I ran. I was the only one who survived. The others were killed, not by partisans, not by allies, by our own men, because they didn't want witnesses. I saw their faces. I know their names, but I will never speak them, because speaking them would mean admitting I let them live. I let them kill my comrades. I let them take the gold. I let them disappear into the world. And I said nothing. This is my confession. I am a coward. Forgive me if you can. At the bottom of the letter, he'd written 3 names: Kommandant Klaus Steiner Obersturmführer, Franz Weber Hauptsturmführer, Hermann Linz SS officers, men who'd orchestrated the convoy, men who'd killed to protect their secret, men who'd disappeared after the war. I researched them immediately. Klaus Steiner died in 1972 in Zurich. Heart attack. Wealthy businessman Franz Weber died in 1981 in Madrid. Cancer. Art collector Hermann Linz, still alive, living in Buenos Aires. Under a different name, 94 years old, wealthy, respected, untouchable. I sat with that information for a month. I didn't know what to do with it. Report it? To who? The man was ancient. Any trial would be symbolic at best. Argentina wouldn't extradite him. Germany wouldn't pursue him. The evidence was circumstantial, and even if he was convicted, it wouldn't bring back what was lost. It wouldn't return the gold to the families it was stolen from. It wouldn't undo 70 years of silence. But staying silent felt like betrayal, not just to the victims, but to my grandfather, because he'd carried this secret his entire life. He'd lived with the weight of it, the guilt of it, and he'd left it for me to decide, to speak or to bury. I thought about Otto Brenner, about Anna Mundt's father, about all the people who knew and said nothing, because silence was easier than guilt, because speaking up would mean admitting they were part of it. But silence isn't neutral. Silence is a choice. And every day of silence is another day the truth stays buried. I thought about the gold bar, about the initials scratched into stone, about my grandfather's letter, and I realized something. He hadn't asked me to forgive him. He'd asked me to choose, to carry the weight or to let it go, and I chose to carry it. I contacted a journalist in Vienna, someone I trusted, someone who specialized in war crimes and historical justice. His name was Daniel Hoffman. I told him everything. I gave him the letter. The names, the gold bar, the journal, the photographs, everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know what will happen if I publish this?" "Yes. There will be denials, lawsuits, threats." "I know. And it might not change anything." I nodded. "But it's the truth." Daniel looked at me. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I thought about my grandfather, about the envelope he left me, about the weight he carried. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure." He published the story 3 months later. It made international headlines. Nazi gold found in Austrian Alps. SS officers stole hundreds of tons, built fortunes in South America. Warehouse 7. The secret. The Wehrmacht. tried to erase. The man in Buenos Aires, Herman Linz, now calling himself Hernan Lopez, denied everything. He called it a fabrication, a conspiracy. He threatened to sue. His lawyers released a statement calling the article baseless defamation. But 2 weeks later, he died, quietly. In his sleep, no trial, no justice, just more silence. But something else happened. Survivors came forward, families who'd lost everything, people who'd spent their entire lives wondering what happened to their grandparents' wedding rings, their fathers' businesses, their mothers' jewelry. They said the story gave them something they'd never had before. Acknowledgement, proof that what was taken from them mattered, that it hadn't been forgotten, that someone finally was willing to say their names. One woman wrote to me, her grandmother had been from Prague, her family's candlesticks, used every Sabbath for generations, had disappeared in 1943. I always wondered where they went, she wrote. Now I know. It doesn't bring them back, but it means something. It means they existed. It means they were real. I went back to Kleinhof one last time. I wanted to tell Otto Brenner what I'd done. I wanted him to know that the silence was over. But when I arrived, Frau Kessler met me at the door. Her eyes were red. He's gone, she said quietly. What? Otto. He passed away last week. My heart sank. How? Peacefully, in his sleep. She paused. He left something for you. She handed me a small box. Inside was a photograph. It showed Otto and my grandfather, standing side by side in front of Warehouse 7. They were young, thin, afraid, boys in uniforms. On the back, in Otto's handwriting, we were children. We didn't know how to say no. Naidil. I stood there for a long time holding that photograph, and I realized something. My grandfather didn't leave me that envelope because he wanted forgiveness. He left it because he wanted someone to know. He wanted someone to carry the weight. Not because it's easy, but because someone has to. Because if no one carries it, the truth dies, and the victims disappear. And the men who did this win. I donated the photograph to the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, along with the gold bar. And my grandfather's letter. They're on display now, in a special exhibit about Warehouse 7, about the stolen gold, about the men who guarded it, the men who stole it, and the families it was taken from. Every day, thousands of people walk past that exhibit. Some stop, some don't, but it's there, a reminder. That history isn't just what we choose to remember, it's also what we choose to uncover. There's a museum in Stuttgart now, small, quiet. It documents the stolen assets of World War II. The gold, the art, the lives. I visit it sometimes. I stand in front of the exhibit about Warehouse 7. I look at my grandfather's photograph, at Otto's face beside his, at the warehouse behind them, and I think about what was lost. Not just the gold, but the names, the stories, the futures that were stolen. I think about my grandfather, about the choice he made to stay silent for so long, and the choice he made at the end to speak, even if only to me. I don't know if that absolves him. I don't think it's my place to decide, but I know this. He gave me the truth, and the truth is a burden, but it's also a gift. Because without it, the victims remain nameless, the crimes remain hidden, and the men who did this remain unpunished. The gold is gone, most of it anyway. Some was recovered, some was returned to families, but most of it disappeared into Swiss bank accounts, Argentine estates, Spanish villas. The men who stole it are gone now, dead, unpunished, living out their lives in comfort while their victims were reduced to ash and memory. But the story remains, and as long as it does, so do the people it was taken from. Their names, their faces, their lives, not erased, not forgotten, remembered. I think about my grandfather often, about the weight he carried, about the silence that consumed him, and I wonder if he ever found peace. I hope he did. I hope that leaving me the envelope gave him some measure of relief, but I'll never know. Because he never spoke, and now he never will. But I can speak, and I have. And as long as I'm alive, I'll keep speaking. For him, for Otto, for Erich Mundt and his daughter Anna, for all the people who knew and stayed silent, and most of all, for the people whose gold it was, the people whose lives were melted down and stamped with seals, the people whose names we'll never know, but whose memory we must carry, because that's what remains. Not the gold, not the warehouse, not the men who stole it, just the memory and the weight and the choice to carry it forward.